Fire the torpedo! Turn the key right now! Those words weren't yelled in a Hollywood movie. They were screamed inside a steel tube where the temperature had just crossed 120 degrees. The air is thick with toxic hydrogen. The oxygen is running out. 78 men are slowly suffocating to death. And right outside the hull, high explosive depth charges are raining down like a relentless thunderstorm. The submarine's radio has been dead for days. There is zero communication with the outside world. For all they know, Moscow is gone. Washington is in ashes. World War III has already started, and the surface of the Earth is a radioactive wasteland. Two senior officers are gripping their launch keys, their eyes filled with raw panic and desperate fury. They are seconds away from launching a 10-kiloton nuclear weapon that will instantly trigger a full-scale atomic apocalypse. But suddenly, the screaming stops. The entire room goes dead silent. Everyone turns their head to look at the third man in the room, a man whose single next word will decide whether 5 billion human beings live or die. How did we get here? How did a dying submarine, buried deep in the pitch-black waters of the Atlantic Ocean, become the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner for the entire planet? To understand the madness of these 13 minutes, we have to pull back, rewind the clock, and look at the terrifying chain of events that set the world on fire. This is where the story begins. We have to look back to October 1962. An American spy plane took a routine flight over Cuba. When the film was processed, the analysts at the CIA froze. The Soviet Union wasn't just sending Cuba tractors and sugar supplies. They were building launch pads, nuclear launch pads, just 90 miles from Florida. If those missiles became operational, the American concept of time would change forever. Before this, a nuclear strike from Russia would take nearly 30 minutes to hit Washington. That was enough time to launch a counterstrike. But from Cuba, it was 5 minutes. 5 minutes from launch to total annihilation. No time to react, no time to hide, no time to think. President John F. Kennedy went on national television. His message to the world was simple, yet devastating. Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. Total nuclear war. To stop the missiles from arriving, the U.S. military established a naval blockade around Cuba. Any Soviet ship crossing that line would be stopped by force. The world held its breath. People started hoarding food. School children practiced hiding under wooden desks, as if a piece of plywood could protect them from a thermonuclear blast. But what the public didn't know, and what even the U.S. military didn't fully realize, was that beneath the surface of the Atlantic, 4 silent phantoms were already moving. 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were heading straight into the trap. Among them was a boat named B-59. And B-59 wasn't just a regular submarine. It carried a secret that would nearly break the world. A Foxtrot-class submarine was an impressive piece of engineering for its time, but it was built for war, not comfort. It was essentially a giant battery surrounded by steel, powered by massive diesel engines when on the surface and electric motors when submerged. It held 78 men, packed into a space smaller than a suburban home. When B-59 left its frozen base in the Arctic Circle, the crew was told they were on a top-secret mission to support Soviet forces in Cuba. But the details were incredibly vague. The Kremlin was playing a high-stakes game of poker, and they didn't want their own soldiers knowing too much. Before they sailed, crews loaded standard torpedoes into the tubes. But into Tube 1 went something different. It was unpainted. It had no markings. It was guarded with absolute secrecy. The crew called it the special weapon. It was a tactical nuclear torpedo. It packed a 10-kiloton warhead. As B-59 moved south from the freezing Arctic into the tropical waters of the Sargasso Sea, the submarine transformed. It ceased to be a machine and became an oven. The temperatures inside the engine and battery rooms spiked to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so thick with moisture that water literally condensed on the cold steel ceilings and dripped back down onto the crew like a greasy, toxic rain. The fresh water supplies were strictly rationed, 1 glass per man per day. Men were stripping down to nothing but their underwear, their bodies covered in heat rashes. Commanding this floating hellhole was Captain Vasili Arkhipov. He was a proud, strict Soviet officer under immense pressure. He knew his submarine was outclassed by the American anti-submarine forces. He knew his mission was critical, but most importantly, he knew the rules of engagement given to him before he left Russia. The orders were terrifyingly ambiguous. You are authorized to use the special weapon if your ship is attacked and sustains structural damage, or upon direct orders from Moscow.
But Savitsky wasn't the only authority on board. Because B-59 was the flagship of the entire flotilla, it also carried the chief of staff of the brigade, Commander Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov wasn't just another officer. He was a legend in the Soviet Navy. A year earlier, he had survived a horrific radiation accident on the ill-fated nuclear submarine K-19. He knew exactly what nuclear weapons could do to the human body. He had seen his friends melt from the inside out. To fire the nuclear torpedo, Soviet protocol required unanimous agreement from 3 men: Captain Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and Commander Arkhipov. If even one of them hesitated, the weapon stayed locked in its tube. And on October 27, 1962, that rule would be tested to its absolute limit. While the crew of B-59 was slowly roasting alive in the dark, above them, the US Navy was playing a lethal game of hide-and-seek. The Americans knew there were Soviet submarines in the area. They didn't know about the nuclear torpedoes, but they knew they could not let these subs get past the blockade line. Inside B-59, the silence was suddenly shattered by a sound every submariner fears in their bones. A sharp, synthetic ping echoed through the hull. Active sonar. The Americans had found them. Savitsky ordered the boat down. They tried to run, to hide in the deep thermal layers of the ocean, where sonar waves bend and distort. But B-59 had a massive problem. Their batteries were nearly dead. To recharge them, they had to run their diesel engines. To run their diesel engines, they had to surface. They were trapped. If they stayed down, they would suffocate. If they went up, they would be captured. Up on the surface, the captain of an American destroyer made a fateful decision. He wanted to force this Soviet ghost to the surface. He ordered his crew to drop signaling depth charges. These were grenade-sized explosives designed to signal a submarine to surface. They weren't meant to sink the submarine. They were meant to say, "We see you. Give up. Come up."
But the Americans made a catastrophic mistake. They didn't tell the Soviets they were using practice charges. And down in the pitch black inside a boiling steel tube, a practice charge doesn't sound like a warning. It sounds like war. A massive boom reverberated through the submarine hull. The red emergency lighting kicked in, casting long, monstrous shadows. The carbon dioxide scrubbing equipment was failing. The air levels were becoming toxic. Imagine the psychological breakdown happening in this room. When carbon dioxide builds up in the human body, it triggers a primal, unstoppable wave of panic. Your judgment becomes clouded by a raw, animal instinct to survive.
Captain Savitsky was experiencing all of this at once. He hadn't slept in days. He was starving, dehydrated, and breathing poison. And every few minutes, another explosion rocked his boat. He asked for a radio update. Nothing. Absolute silence from Moscow. For all Savitsky knew, the war had been going on for hours. He envisioned his homeland in ruins, his family vaporized by American missiles. He looked out his periscope, but it was too dark to see anything but the flashing searchlights of American destroyers circling him like sharks. Savitsky lost his patience. The psychological pressure snapped. He turned to his officers and screamed that maybe the war had already started up there. He shouted that they were going to blast us now, that they would die, but they would sink them all. The clock started now. 13 minutes that would decide the fate of 5 billion people. Savitsky ordered the crew to prepare torpedo tube number 1, the nuclear torpedo. In the torpedo room, the crew worked in a daze. They knew what this weapon was. They knew that if they fired it, the blast would likely destroy the American fleet. But at this close range, the shockwave might also crack their own hull open like an eggshell. It was a suicide mission. To arm the weapon, Savitsky needed authorization. He looked at political officer Ivan Maslenikov, driven by fear and duty, agreed instantly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his launch key, and inserted it into the console. 2 out of 3. The weapon was live. The only thing standing between humanity and a nuclear apocalypse was one man. Vasili Arkhipov looked at his captain. He looked at the key in the console. He knew the protocol. If he said yes, the world would end.
Arkhipov remembered K-19. He knew what radiation did to the world. He looked past the panic, past the carbon dioxide poisoning, and he forced his brain to do something his captain couldn't. He analyzed the situation logically.
Savitsky was screaming directly into Archipov's face, pointing at the launch button, claiming they were being attacked and that it was their duty to fire. But Arkhipov didn't blink. He looked at the rhythm of the explosions outside. He realized something crucial. Arkhipov told Savitsky to think about it. If they wanted to destroy the submarine, they would already be dead. These weren't depth charges. They were signals. They were asking them to talk. But Savitsky was too far gone. He refused to listen. Maslenikov backed the captain. They outnumbered Arkhipov 2-1. In any other Soviet submarine, Arkhipov would be overruled. But because Arkhipov was the chief of staff of the entire brigade, his veto is absolute. For 13 minutes, the argument raged in the sweltering heat of the command module. Men were watching, holding their breath, waiting to see if they would become the catalysts for the end of days. Finally, Arkhipov delivered his ultimatum. He didn't just say no, he offered a way out. Arkhipov looked Savitsky in the eye and told him they would not fire. He said they would surface and they would request instructions from Moscow. If the war had begun, they would tell them. If not, they would save their men. Savitsky looked at his crew, realized how close he just came to crossing the line of no return, and nodded. Massive bubbles erupted from the ballast tanks as the B-59 blew its tanks, its heavy steel nose angling sharply upward toward the light. On the surface of the Atlantic, the crews of the American destroyers watched in fascination as a massive black Soviet submarine suddenly breached the waves. The hatch opened, and Captain Savitsky and Vasili Arkhipov stepped out onto the conning tower. The blinding sun hit their faces. They took a deep, desperate breath of fresh, cool ocean air. They looked out at the American fleet. There were no flashing broadsides. There were no nuclear fires on the horizon. The American ships didn't open fire. Instead, a U.S. destroyer pulled alongside, and an American sailor offered the Soviets fresh water and tobacco. The war hadn't started. Civilization was still intact. When B-59 finally returned to Russia, there were no medals. There were no parades. The Soviet High Command was embarrassed that their top-secret submarines had been found and forced to surface by the Americans. One high-ranking admiral even told the crews that it would have been better if they had gone down with their ships. Vasili Arkhipov never boasted about what he did. He didn't write a best-selling book. He went back to his life, served out his career, and eventually retired as a vice admiral. The details of what happened during those 13 minutes inside B-59 remained a closely guarded state secret for 40 years. It wasn't until 2002, at a conference commemorating the anniversary of the crisis, that the truth finally came out. Historians and military analysts looked at the logs, realized how close B-59 had come to launching a nuclear weapon, and reached a terrifying consensus. If that torpedo had been fired, the U.S. would have responded with everything they had. The world would have ended in 1962. Vasili Arkhipov didn't dismantle a missile system or sign a peace treaty. He simply had the courage to stay calm when everyone around him was screaming for destruction. He gave humanity another day. If you want to make sure stories like Archipov's are never forgotten, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. What do you think is the most terrifying near miss in human history? Let's talk about it down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.